Imagine being so dangerous that the FBI keeps you in solitary confinement for a year without a trial. No violence. No weapons. Just a phone and a brilliant mind. Kevin Mitnick could hack into NORAD, crash the stock market, or trigger nuclear missiles with nothing but a payphone and his voice. At least, that's what the FBI wanted you to believe. They painted him as a digital terrorist, so dangerous that even touching a computer could unleash Cyber-Armageddon. The truth? He was just a curious kid who loved puzzles. But his 2.5-year manhunt became the most expensive cybercrime investigation in FBI history. They used military-grade surveillance, Hollywood-level propaganda, and constitutional violations that would make Orwell blush. When they finally caught him, they discovered something terrifying. Kevin Mitnick had never actually committed the crimes. That made him famous. The FBI had created a monster, and the monster was themselves. Why did the government need a digital boogeyman so badly? And what really happened during those missing years when Kevin disappeared into the shadows? Drop a if you think Kevin Mitnick was a scapegoat for government incompetence. Comment below. What's the real reason the FBI feared one man with a modem more than actual terrorists? Kevin David Mitnick was born on August 6, 1963, in Van Nuys, California, to parents who had no idea they were raising the future world's most wanted computer criminal. His childhood was far from extraordinary. A middle-class Jewish family, divorced parents, and a shy kid who found refuge in puzzles and magic tricks. But beneath this ordinary exterior was a mind that would soon turn the entire cybersecurity establishment upside down. The first signs of Kevin's unconventional thinking appeared early. At age 12, he discovered that Los Angeles buses used a simple punch card system for transfers. Instead of paying full fare, Kevin figured out how to manipulate the system by collecting discarded transfer tickets and using a hole punch to create valid passes for any route. It wasn't about the money. His family wasn't poor. It was about solving the puzzle and beating the system. But it was Kevin's introduction to phone phreaking that would set the course for his legendary career. In 1977, at age 14, he stumbled upon a book that would change everything. The Phone Phreaker's Handbook. The underground world of telephone system manipulation fascinated him completely. Here was a community of people who understood that every system had rules, and every rule could be bent or broken with enough creativity and persistence. Kevin's first serious hack targeted the phone system itself. He discovered that by calling certain numbers and playing specific tones, he could manipulate the telephone network's switching equipment. This wasn't theoretical. He could make free long-distance calls, redirect other people's calls, and even access phone company internal systems. More importantly, he realized that the human element was often the weakest link in any security system. His technique was elegant in its simplicity: research, patience, and social engineering. Kevin would spend hours in libraries studying telephone company manuals, organizational charts, and technical documentation that was supposed to be internal only. He memorized employee names, department structures, and company jargon. When he called Pacific Bell employees, he didn't sound like a teenager from Van Nuys. He sounded like he belonged there. "Hi, this is Kevin from Central Office Maintenance," became his standard opening. "I'm having trouble with a line test and need you to verify some switch configurations." Most employees, eager to be helpful and never suspecting they were talking to a high school student, would readily provide access codes, passwords, and technical information. By 1979, Kevin had assembled a small group of like-minded phone phreaks who shared information and techniques. But unlike many in the community who were content with making free calls, Kevin was driven by a deeper curiosity about how systems worked and how they could be manipulated. He wasn't interested in financial gain. He was addicted to the intellectual challenge, and the rush of accessing forbidden systems. His reputation in the underground began to grow. Other phone freaks spoke in hushed tones about the teenager who could seemingly access any phone company system at will. Kevin's techniques were becoming more sophisticated, combining technical knowledge with psychological manipulation in ways that hadn't been seen before. The turning point came when Kevin successfully penetrated the computer systems at Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, one of the world's largest computer manufacturers. This wasn't just about phone systems anymore. Kevin had crossed into the realm of computer hacking, where the stakes were much higher and the attention from law enforcement would be far more serious. What Kevin didn't realize was that his activities were being monitored. Corporate security officers were beginning to compare notes about suspicious calls and unauthorized access attempts. A pattern was emerging, and that pattern pointed to a brilliant young man who was about to become the most wanted cybercriminal in American history. The stage was set for a cat-and-mouse game that would span decades and redefine how society thought about computer crime, digital privacy, and the power of information in the modern world. In 1981, 18-year-old Kevin Mitnick encountered someone who would fundamentally change his approach to hacking. Susan Thunder, the mysterious blonde social engineer, had already achieved legendary status in the underground for her ability to extract sensitive information from any target using nothing but her voice and psychological manipulation. When Kevin first spoke with Susan over a crackling long-distance connection, he knew he was talking to someone who operated on an entirely different level. Susan became Kevin's unofficial mentor, teaching him that the most sophisticated computer security in the world was worthless if you could simply convince a human to give you access. Under her tutelage, Kevin's already impressive technical skills were enhanced with a masterclass education in human psychology and manipulation. People want to help, Susan taught him during their late-night phone conversations. They want to feel important, useful. Your job is to become whatever they need you to be: a confused colleague, an urgent executive, a helpful technician. Make them want to solve your problem. Kevin absorbed these lessons with the intensity of a devoted student. He learned to research targets meticulously, to adopt appropriate personas for each situation, and most importantly, to sound completely natural and authoritative when making his requests. By 1982, Kevin had evolved from a talented phone freak into something far more dangerous: a master social engineer with advanced technical skills. His partnership with Susan reached its peak during their successful infiltration of Pacific Bell's central switching office. While Susan orchestrated the social engineering campaign that gathered intelligence about security procedures and personnel schedules, Kevin handled the technical aspects of actually accessing the computer systems once they had the necessary information. The operation was a masterpiece of coordination. Susan spent weeks building relationships with Pacific Bell employees, learning their names, schedules, and responsibilities. She discovered which security guards were on duty, when, which managers would be traveling, and most crucially, how the building's access control systems worked. When Kevin finally entered the facility using credentials and access codes Susan had obtained, he found himself with unprecedented access to the telecommunications infrastructure serving millions of customers. He could monitor phone calls, access customer records, and even control the switching equipment that routed calls across the network. But Kevin made a crucial mistake that would define the rest of his criminal career. He couldn't resist exploring further. While Susan's approach was surgical and focused, Kevin's curiosity drove him to access systems and information far beyond their original objectives. He downloaded source code, technical manuals, and proprietary software, not for financial gain, but simply because he wanted to understand how everything worked. This digital hoarding would later become Kevin's signature and his downfall. Unlike other hackers who penetrated systems for specific goals, Kevin collected information the way others collected stamps. His computer contained terabytes of stolen data from dozens of companies, not because he planned to use it, but because he found it fascinating. The success at Pacific Bell also marked the beginning of law enforcement's serious interest in Kevin Mitnick. Corporate security directors began comparing notes about suspicious activities, and Kevin's name started appearing in incident reports across multiple companies. The FBI's newly formed computer crime unit took notice of the young man whose activities seemed to span the entire telecommunications industry. More troubling for Kevin was what happened to Susan Thunder. In late 1982, his mentor mysteriously disappeared from the underground community. Rumors spread that she had been compromised by federal agents, possibly turned into an informant. Kevin never learned the truth about Susan's fate, but her vanishing served as a chilling reminder that the golden age of invisible hacking was coming to an end. Without Susan's moderating influence, Kevin's activities became increasingly reckless. He began targeting more prestigious systems, taking greater risks, and leaving more obvious traces of his presence. The shy teenager who had started by manipulating bus transfers was evolving into something that would terrify corporate America and federal law enforcement, a hacker with no apparent limits and no fear of consequences. The monster that would dominate FBI headlines for the next decade was being born, one authorized access at a time. By 1988, Kevin Mitnick had transformed from a curious teenager into what federal prosecutors would later describe as the most notorious computer criminal in United States history. But the path to that infamy was paved with a series of increasingly audacious hacks that demonstrated both his incredible technical abilities and his complete lack of understanding about the political forces building against him. Kevin's breakthrough into the big leagues came with his infiltration of digital equipment. Corporation DEC, one of the world's premier computer manufacturers. This wasn't just another phone company hack. DEC was at the forefront of computer technology, and their systems contained some of the most closely guarded trade secrets in the industry. For Kevin, it represented the ultimate intellectual challenge. DEC hack showcased Kevin's evolution into a complete cyber warrior. He combined advanced technical skills with sophisticated social engineering to penetrate layer after layer of security. He didn't just break into DEC systems. He lived in them for months, exploring their network architecture, studying their proprietary software, and downloading massive amounts of source code and internal documentation. What made Kevin's approach revolutionary was his patience and methodology. Rather than smashing through security like a digital vandal, he moved through DEC systems like a ghost, careful to cover his tracks and avoid detection. He understood that the longer he remained undetected, the more he could learn and the more access he could gain. Kevin's technique involved creating legitimate-looking user accounts, using social engineering to gather passwords and access codes, and gradually escalating his privileges until he had administrative control over entire networks. He became expert at mimicking the digital behavior patterns of legitimate users, making his presence virtually invisible to security monitoring systems. The DEC hack yielded an unprecedented treasure trove of information. Kevin obtained the complete source code for DEC's VMS operating system, software that powered critical systems in government agencies, military installations, and major corporations around the world. He also accessed development plans for future computer systems, internal security protocols, and customer lists containing some of the most sensitive organizations in America. But Kevin's most dangerous acquisition was something he probably didn't fully appreciate at the time: credibility within the hacker underground. Word of the DEC penetration spread through bulletin board systems and underground networks, elevating Kevin to legendary status among computer criminals worldwide. He had proven that no system was truly secure, no corporation too powerful to Penetrate. This reputation attracted other hackers who wanted to learn from the master. Kevin found himself at the center of a loose network of cyber criminals who shared techniques, targets, and stolen information. He became both teacher and coordinator, helping orchestrate attacks on telecommunications companies, defense contractors, and technology firms across the country. However, Kevin's success was creating exactly the kind of attention he couldn't afford. Corporate security directors were no longer dealing with isolated incidents. They were facing coordinated attacks from what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal organization. The FBI's computer crime unit began treating Kevin not as a talented teenager with boundary issues, but as the leader of a cyber-terrorist network threatening American technological supremacy. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. In July 1988, Kevin was arrested at his apartment in Calabasas, California. The FBI raid was conducted with military precision. Agents seized computers, phones, documents, and anything else that might contain evidence of his digital crimes. For the first time, Kevin faced the reality that his actions had serious legal consequences. But the arrest was just the beginning of Kevin's problems. Federal prosecutors, eager to make an example of the young hacker, painted him as a digital terrorist whose activities threatened national security. They claimed his stolen software could be used to compromise military systems, disrupt critical infrastructure, and potentially endanger lives. The media coverage was explosive. Kevin Mitnick became the face of a new kind of criminal, the computer hacker who could strike anywhere, anytime, using nothing more than a keyboard and an internet connection. Newspaper headlines described him as a computer terrorist and a digital menace who represented an existential threat to America's technological infrastructure. The stage was set for a legal and media circus that would define Kevin's life for the next decade. Kevin Mitnick's first encounter with the federal justice system should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it became the prologue to the most expensive cybercrime manhunt in FBI history. After his 1988 arrest, Kevin was sentenced to a year in prison and 3 years of supervised probation. But the conditions of his probation would prove to be his undoing. He was forbidden from using computers, modems, or even cellular phones without explicit permission from his probation officer. For someone whose entire identity was built around digital exploration, this restriction was psychological torture. Kevin lasted exactly 5 months before violating his probation by accessing computer systems at work. When authorities discovered the violation in 1992, Kevin made a decision that would transform him from a notorious hacker into America's most wanted cyber criminal. He disappeared. Kevin's escape wasn't traumatic or violent. It was simply elegant. One day he was Kevin Mitnick, convicted computer criminal under federal supervision. The next day he was gone, vanished into the digital underground with skills that made him nearly impossible to track through conventional means. What followed was a 2.5-year game of cat and mouse that captured headlines worldwide and redefined how law enforcement approached cybercrime. Kevin didn't just disappear. He became a digital ghost, using his hacking skills to create false identities, obtain fake documentation, and stay one step ahead of a federal task force dedicated solely to capturing him. During his fugitive years, Kevin operated under multiple aliases, living in cities across the country while continuing his hacking activities. He had learned to blend into suburban anonymity while maintaining his digital presence in the underground community. He rented apartments under false names, obtained fake driver's licenses and credit cards, and even managed to get legitimate jobs using fabricated identities. But Kevin couldn't resist the intellectual challenge that had driven him since childhood. Even while running from federal agents, he continued penetrating computer systems, stealing proprietary software, and pushing the boundaries of what was possible in cyberspace. His targets during this period read like a who's who of American technology: Motorola, Nokia, Fujitsu, and dozens of other corporations found their most sensitive systems compromised by the phantom hacker. The FBI's pursuit became increasingly desperate and expensive. They assembled a task force of agents, computer experts, and corporate security specialists whose sole mission was capturing Kevin Mitnick. The investigation consumed millions of dollars and thousands of hours as federal agents followed digital breadcrumbs across the country. Kevin's downfall began with his fascination with cellular phone technology. He had become obsessed with understanding how cell phones worked and how their security could be circumvented. This interest led him to target Tsutomu Shimomura, a computational physicist and computer security expert whose research into cellular phone vulnerabilities represented the cutting edge of wireless security. In December 1994, Kevin hacked into Shimomura's computer systems, stealing files related to cellular phone security research. But Kevin made a crucial mistake. He taunted his victim, leaving behind digital graffiti that essentially announced his presence. For Shimomura, this wasn't just a computer crime. It was personal. Shimomura partnered with federal agents and telecommunications companies to develop new techniques for tracking cellular phone usage and digital communications. Using advanced monitoring equipment and novel forensic techniques, they began closing in on Kevin's location with scientific precision. The end came on February 15, 1995. In Raleigh, North Carolina, Kevin was arrested at his apartment by FBI agents who had been monitoring his cellular phone usage and internet activities. The most wanted cybercriminal in America was finally in custody, but his capture was just the beginning of an even more controversial chapter in his story. The media coverage was unprecedented. Kevin Mitnick had become more than just a computer criminal. He was a symbol of the new digital age's dangers and possibilities. Federal prosecutors portrayed him as a cyber terrorist whose activities had caused millions of dollars in damage and threatened national security itself. But Kevin's supporters argued that he was being persecuted for intellectual curiosity, that his crimes were victimless, and that the government was using him as a scapegoat for their own cybersecurity failures. Stage was set for a legal battle that would test the boundaries of justice in the digital age. Kevin Mitnick's arrest in February 1995 should have marked the end of his story as a fugitive hacker. Instead, it became the beginning of a legal and human rights controversy that would expose the deep paranoia and constitutional violations lurking within America's approach to cybercrime. What happened to Kevin during the next 4 years would demonstrate that sometimes the government's response to a perceived threat is far more dangerous than the threat itself. Immediately after his arrest, Kevin was placed in solitary confinement at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Los Angeles. Federal prosecutors argued that he was too dangerous to be housed with other prisoners, claiming that he could use any phone to hack into computer systems, manipulate prison security, or even trigger nuclear weapons. These weren't exaggerations. For dramatic effect, these were actual arguments made by federal attorneys in court documents that the government's portrayal of Kevin had evolved from computer criminal to digital supervillain. Prosecutors claimed he had caused over $300 million in damages to corporations and government agencies. They alleged he could whistle nuclear launch codes into a payphone, crash airplanes by hacking air traffic control systems, and bring down the entire internet with a single phone call. None of these claims were true, but they served their purpose, keeping Kevin in isolation while the government built their case. For 8 months, Kevin sat alone in a cell, denied access to computers, phones, and even written materials that might contain technical information. He was treated like a maximum security terrorist, despite never being convicted of a violent crime. The solitary confinement was psychological torture disguised as security precaution. Kevin spent 23 hours a day alone in a small cell with 1 hour for exercise in an empty yard. He was denied access to books about computers, mathematics, or technology. He couldn't even read science fiction novels if they contained technical concepts that prosecutors deemed potentially dangerous. Kevin's defense team, led by attorney Donald Randolph, fought desperately to expose the absurdity of the government's claims. They brought in computer experts who testified that Kevin's alleged superpowers were technologically impossible. They documented how the government's own cybersecurity experts had debunked the claims being made by prosecutors, but the damage was done. The media had embraced the narrative of Kevin as a digital terrorist, and public opinion supported whatever measures were necessary to contain him. Movies, books, and television shows portrayed him as a master criminal whose technological abilities bordered on supernatural. Meanwhile, the actual evidence against Kevin was far more mundane. Yes, he had illegally accessed corporate computer systems. Yes, he had stolen proprietary software and technical information. But the government could never prove that he had caused significant financial damage, sold stolen information, or used his access for anything more sinister than intellectual curiosity. The breakthrough in Kevin's case came when his supporters began organizing an international campaign highlighting the human rights violations in his treatment. Computer scientists, civil liberties advocates, and even former government officials began questioning why a non-violent computer criminal was being held in conditions normally reserved for terrorists and violent criminals. In March 1999, after 4 years in federal custody, most of it in solitary confinement, Kevin finally accepted a plea bargain. He pled guilty to 7 felony counts related to computer fraud and served a total of 5 years in prison, with credit for time already served. The conditions of his release included a ban on using computers or the internet for 3 years. Kevin's release in January 2000 marked the end of the most expensive cybercrime prosecution in American history. But it also marked the beginning of his transformation from notorious criminal to cybersecurity consultant and advocate for digital civil liberties. The young man who had started by manipulating bus transfers had survived a decade-long ordeal that exposed the government's technological ignorance and constitutional disregard. Kevin Mitnick, the FBI's most wanted digital fugitive, had become something far more dangerous to establishment thinking. A living symbol of government overreach in the digital age, his story would inspire a generation of hackers, privacy advocates, and civil libertarians who understood that in the battle between individual curiosity and institutional control, the real threat to American values might not be the hackers at all. Kevin Mitnick's story didn't end with his release from prison. It transformed completely. The man once branded as the world's most dangerous hacker became one of cybersecurity's most respected consultants. Today, companies pay millions for the same skills that once landed him in solitary confinement. His consulting firm, Mitnick Security, helps Fortune 500 companies protect themselves from the very attacks he pioneered. The techniques he developed for social engineering are now taught in cybersecurity courses worldwide. Kevin proved that sometimes the best defense against hackers is hiring a reformed one. The government's treatment of Kevin exposed the dangerous intersection of technological ignorance and prosecutorial overreach. His case became a landmark in digital civil rights, influencing how cybercriminals are prosecuted and detained. The constitutional violations he endured helped establish legal protections for future defendants in cybercrime cases. Most importantly, Kevin's story reveals a fundamental truth about the digital age. Curiosity isn't a crime, but fear of technology can create real monsters, not in the form of hackers, but in the form of governments willing to abandon constitutional principles to combat threats they don't understand. Kevin Mitnick died in 2023, but his legacy lives on in every cybersecurity professional who understands that the human element remains the weakest link in any system.